So good morning again, thank you. And thank you, Tom, for the good summary of the previous roundtable. I want to thank my co-author, Nir Sharav, who unfortunately could not be with us. He was actually called for an urgent meeting with the General Secretary of the Ministry of Transport regarding our National Highway Road Strategic Plan. So he could not be with us now. But Yuval Shiftan and Karen Maltens are with us here. We'll start with a brief introduction, really brief on our equity, but this is not the topic. The topic is really equity within the appraisal context. So we'll discuss some theoretical issues and some issues with the process, with the CBA. I'm coming from a notion that people know everything about the main issues, but I'll and the paper is quite extensive about it, but I want to highlight some of the issues and some of the problems. Then I'll briefly touch about the analytical framework regarding mostly the travel demand model and the data used, and their limitation for appropriate equity consideration. And then we'll move to the main part, which is two Israeli case studies, one of Tel Aviv introducing more social equity, and one in the rail to the periphery introducing more spatial equity. So just in really a very brief introduction, when we talk about equity, so we talk about three elements: dimension, distribution, which is mostly how goods and bads are different between various population groups, and this is what really our focus in transportation. We talked about recognition, the way people are being addressed and related to, and we talked about representation, which is really the ability of person to impact decision, to take process in the political process. So talking about distribution and equity, there are endless number of questions and issues, and it's a very multi-dimension area. But we mostly talk about which good and bads are the focus of the analysis. Are we looking at accessibility, travel time saving, other impacts when we talked about what we are looking at the distribution of, which population group should be distinguished, whether it's intergeneration, intrageneration, socio-economic, geography, spatial, and what constitutes a moral properly distribution? What is the moral way, what is right, equitable? I mean, are we looking at having everybody equal? Are we looking at having the worse off better? Are we looking by the ability to pay, etc.? So all these issues are with really a general equity discussion, which I'm not going to get into more than what I said so far. Looking at how we incorporate equity in appraisal, the first question is really looking at what is the purpose of transportation planning. And Tom kind of already emphasized in his presentations the importance of having clear objective and strategies. And obviously the issue of how we consider equity and how we consider equity should come into these questions. So we'll briefly discuss that there are basically the traditional approach to transport planning, and obviously every government and every society may have a specific objective, which is a number 3 here, other policy objectives. But the traditional, when we look at the general process that I think that Tom described is in presentation, we looked at an effective and efficient movement. And then basically we look at the functioning of the transportation system, reducing congestion, and providing mobility. We want to suggest that when we're looking at equity, it may be more important to look at the purpose of transportation planning in really providing adequate accessibility for all, and we discuss it in more detail. And obviously the most common approaches to appraisal is cost-benefit analysis and the multi-criteria analysis, and there are many variations on them. The literature is full of all kinds of variation and advanced method, but I claim that they eventually all come down to those two, cost-benefit analysis and multi-criteria analysis, with some kind of improvement or variation. Getting into some of the issues of the cost-benefit analysis again, and my purpose is not to explain cost-benefit analysis, but only to touch on the issue regarding equity analysis. Cost-benefit analysis, we usually look at maximize welfare. So we're looking at what's the maximum, I mean, whether it's benefit cost, whether it's net present value. we mostly look at the total benefit minus or pair total cost, and we look at it in a microeconomic welfare principle. It's first of all, it's an aggregate measure. We look at the total benefit minus the total cost. So by definition, it does not distinguish between certain population group. And therefore, by definition, it's hard to account for equity within the cost-benefit analysis. It is based on the willingness to pay, basically the willingness to pay the principle of consumer surplus as a benefit. And therefore, by definition, those who are the better off, the richer, are willing to pay more. And obviously, the benefit of the riches are counted more. And looking at actual trips, the more trip, the more benefit. And we use usually the willingness to pay, which is mostly the value of time. So we look at time saving. So the more trips making, and the richer also make more trips, the more time we save. So that's again why basically it's actually kind of not working into the direction of equity. And given that in most practical application of transportation projects, travel time saving is a main benefit from the project, even if you account for all benefits. Therefore, this is quite a significant problem when we think about equity. The common approach to somewhat incorporate equity within the framework of cost-benefit analysis is what we call use of equity value, most notably the equity value of time, which basically, and this is, I think, the practice in most countries, well, all that I know of, I would say, this is a practice in all countries, a guidance for cost-benefit analysis, that you use a standard one value of time for all the population. Maybe not from all three purposes, but you don't segment, you don't differentiate value of time by socio-economic variables. Okay, it may be different from three purposes, but it will not be different between the rich and the poor. Some approaches even suggested to use what we call reverse value, i.e. give the lower income higher value of time. So somewhat correct for the bias, and sometimes some of the work, also some of the work that previous work I did with my student Batchen Nachmias Biran, we actually developed some value that kind of look at marginal benefit of income and try to look from those studies how to account for those who really are lower off, their benefits are higher with some smaller improvement than the richer. But the bottom line is that there's no right way to do it. I mean, there's no right answer to have a trade-off between the equity and the maximized social welfare, which by definition, if you maximize social welfare, you will not be equitable. So we want to do some kind of a trade-off, incorporate them somehow together, but there's no one right way to do it. And when we do it in cost-benefit analysis, it's not really seen, observed to the policymaker. So we can tell them we accounted for equity, but they don't really see. And accordingly, the common approach is really a multi-criteria analysis. The advantage of multi-criteria analysis, clearly you show a matrix of impacts. And the matrix of impacts can include equity as a separate measure. And therefore, people and policymakers can look at it and make the trade-off. Usually in cost-benefit, in multi-criteria analysis, we either show the different criteria, we either make an overall score based on some weights, and there's the role of stakeholder-specific weighting, which may result in multiple parallel outcomes. So the multi-criteria, again, we can leave it to the policymaker as one table showing the different criteria and let the policymaker go from here. But usually policymakers like to see some overall ranking. And then it's a role of stakeholder or whatever way we decide to put weights on the different criteria. Many times we have different and multiple weights for different policy objectives. For example, environmental weights, a set of weights, equity and set of, so be more equitable, be more in the economic. The important thing is, again, we also can account for various equity indicators. I talked in the very first slide of the introduction how there may be a lot of different indicators for equity, a lot of criteria, a lot of population groups. So basically, when you do multi-criteria analysis, you can as well present various equity measures, like the Gini is only one of them, but also different measures and for different breakdown of population group. However, even represented inequity in such a way in multi-criteria analysis does not guarantee that the more equitable project will score better than projects that are clearly less equitable. So, and usually in the practical applications that I've seen, even within the multi-criteria analysis, the cost-benefit analysis is usually one of the criteria, and it's usually a criteria that will get a high weight, and maybe it's right, I'm not saying it's wrong, but it just means that equity will not get a very high hand. So, but the bottom line from this discussion, in both cost-benefit analysis and multi-criteria, do not guarantee that most equity projects selected because it is not the underlying objective that underline this this approach. And then what and really for the credit of Karl Martens, who is with us, really have been preaching for some time, that really the purpose of transportation planning should take equity as a key goal of government policy, providing equitable accessibility for all. And this is similar to some other domain like education, housing, and health, where providing housing, minimum housing to everybody is the national policy in some countries. Rather in transport, it's hardly the case, and it's more equity seen as a mere impact rather than a key goal of government policies. So the purpose of transport system should be, in this sense, to really provide adequate accessibility to all. Equity, now, the accessibility is obviously one issue of the equity, of the transport impact. I mean, there are many other impacts and externalities. Those should be of secondary importance, which we look at on the distribution. So mostly, when it's a transportation project, let's look at providing a minimum accessibility. And then Karl Martens suggested to define the purpose of transportation planning as the field of government that seek to guarantee adequate accessibility for all through the regulation, operation, maintenance, and improvement of the transport system. So accordingly, equity should be the main objective from the initial stages of transportation planning. So it's not the issue here that it's not enough to count it for equity. It should really start with the process of project selection, because if you don't bring their equitable project selection to the appraisal process, they will not be able to pass it. So if I summarize this part in short, so we look at effective and efficient movement as a purpose of transport planning. Here the focus is usually really on the transport network. These issues, while it's a different issue to really focus on accessibility and on population group, and therefore look at it from the planning process. So that's a section, more discussion. One I want shortly to, and this is, I'll do this really briefly. It's a big issue by itself. What I'm claiming, and I'm not, the things are in the paper, and I will do it short in a way to really comprehend it through the presentation. But I want to highlight the things. If people are interested, it should really read the paper. But the bottom line is that I'm claiming that travel demand models that we use to do our appraisal, and all the appraisal are based on transportation travel demand models that provide the input necessarily for evaluating the different impacts, are somewhat biased by the data we use in the travel demand model in terms of when we come to equity. So it starts with a traditional travel demand model, what is known as the 4-step model, which is pretty much the main tool by most metropolitan planning organizations. Was originally developed in the 50s, in the US, where the focus was in the interstate highway to provide high mobility. Looking at the data that use, the data are most common, the main data to develop this model are the travel habit survey, what people actually do, what they travel. We also look at data from the network about speeds, volume, so what kind of activity. So the data are about actually trips that are being made. We have no data about trips that people do not make, would like to make, and don't make because of lack of accessibility, what we call, so there's no potential mobility data. travel, the traditional model, which is again is currently in most metropolitan area. It's an aggregate model. It's based on traffic analysis zone, which may be large and have big differences in socio-economic within them. So we cannot really distinction between population group within this TZ. We can distinguish between different zones and higher income zone and lower income zone, but not in difference within. And the last things I really not get into, most of this model assume that the total amount of trips will not vary by the transportation system. And I claim, and this I really send you to the paper, I'll not even try to explain it, it's long, that this overestimate benefit to car users and bias towards road projects. The rule of half kind of help to give it the right treatment to it, but it's hardly used in practical application. Then we move to the activity-based model, which are considered the state-of-the-art of travel demand model. Those have some important benefits for equity analysis. First of all, they are disaggregate. They're really the individual level. They are estimated and applied at individual level. So the main advantage, they can really analyze benefit by any group of population of interest. And they also can provide a good equity measure to be used in multi-criteria analysis. From their analytical structure, and again, I'm not getting into the detail, they're able to calculate what we call the activity-based accessibility measure, where it's emphasis on accessibility rather than trip. It's based on the individual characteristic. And as Gerard de Jong with us here, they show in some paper in the measure, which is called log sum, it's based on consumer surplus idea and can be translated to monetary term as well if we want to include it in cost benefit analysis. But there have been very few actual application of it. I did see what Gerard did it, but it's pretty rare practically used. And the bottom line that even metropolitan, that area that have such models, like the Tel Aviv is one of the first, no, the Tel Aviv is the first to have such a practical model. It really does not enable to use its full benefit for equity just because it's really too complicated. It's still too complicated analytically to really use it for its full benefit. Okay, I went a little bit 2-3 more minutes that I wanted on this part, but I'll go now to the main part, which actually, as I said, Nir Sharav was supposed to present. I'll present instead of him. He's really leading most of the important Israeli strategic plans on the practical side. So we'll briefly talk about the National Appraisal Framework and then go into the 2 case studies. This is really briefly, first, the National Appraisal Framework is basically, we redid it in 2012, and then there were updates in 16 and another update recently. It's basically based on cost-benefit analysis, but it does require also to show a multi-criteria analysis. So it shows also a multi-criteria analysis with various impacts, including accessibility, safety, environmental, and have also some equity concern. But again, the practice is that there's a high focus on the cost-benefit analysis, even within the multi-criteria analysis. So let me jump directly to the Tel Aviv case. A brief introduction to Tel Aviv. Tel Aviv, it's in the center of Israel. It's the largest metropolitan area with currently 4 million people. This is about half of Israel in terms of population. For a little less than half, it's half in terms of workplace, and it's little more than half in contribution to the GDP. This is the main business. It's not the capital. Jerusalem is the capital, but this is the center of business and everything. Israel is the fastest growing Western country in the world. We have a growth of population growth of something like 2% a year, and Tel Aviv is estimated to be 5.4 million already in 2040. It's one of the most congested cities in the Western world. If not, then you can see the picture on the right. It's just a typical picture from the main highway crossing Tel Aviv, Ayalon Highway. It has very limited mass transit. It's mostly based on bus systems and public transportation. It's very behind in terms of investment in rail right of lane. I mean, what you see here in the picture on the bottom, you see the Tel Aviv, the rail line in Tel Aviv, but also mostly the national rail line. So we don't have really separate, we have one rail system, which is the Israeli national rail system, and it does serve Tel Aviv as a metropolitan area as a suburban train as well. If we compare Tel Aviv to Madrid and Berlin, which are similar size in population and area, we see this is a real similar scale. Look at Madrid with its network, Berlin with its network. We are far behind in the public transportation use in the metropolitan area is only about 10%, while you look at European equivalent city, it's about 40%. And I don't think Tel Aviv is 4 million. There's no single metropolitan area in Europe. It's more than 3 million people that does not have a mass transit as a metro system. So that's where we are. We are right behind in our public transportation plan and investment. And accordingly, the government was really looking into develop the strategic public transport plan with a target year of 2040. This has been going now for some 10 years. It started with various improvements. And it did look, and it did specifically here, did set strategic at the nation levels where a special national strategic planning team, steering committee for the project and for the strategic plan. And they did define the multi-criteria analysis, and basically were with 4 main criteria. And under 4 criteria, they did some sub-criteria. Equity was inserted as one criteria within the transportation general criteria, together with accessibility in addition to equity, but again, transit usage, transit speed, and performance. Economic was given 30%, and again, the various regular economic indicator, but including the CBA, but also agglomeration benefit as a more macroeconomic impact. It was given 20% to quality of life and the environment. And here we look at population coverage, transfer, reliability, various safety, environmental, all this went under here. And another criteria which we usually do in Israel is feasibility, make sure that what we give some weight to what we choose is actually being implemented within reasonable effort and time. So I'm not going to the detail. I really want to focus on what we did for equity. Just in terms of a brief discussion on the actual final plan of the strategic plan. What we see here, the plan includes 3 metro lines. The yellow line, which is a kind of almost like 2 line because it has 2 branches on each of the other than the center. The green line, which is the east-west, and a semicircular line, this brown line. Those are 3 metro lines. This is complement. These are all under advanced planning, but it's nothing in the ground yet. There are 3 light rail lines. The red line, which is currently being constructed, was supposed to be open already. Now planned to be open next year. And there's 2 additional lines, the green line and the purple line, which are under advanced planning stage, with initial work in the area, but no construction of the rail yet. And this is also complemented by 3 BRT lines. So it's a comprehensive plan, including metro, light rail, BRT, supporting bus services, and supporting cycling network. I mean, it includes various elements. There are now discussing also congestion pricing. There's a big discussion on various issues. What I'm going to show in the next slides from now for this case is really the analysis we did regarding accessibility and equity. So these were things we at the planning team and were kind of doing as an extra, were not required by the committee or mission, but we did various figure and measures and tables to show the impact on accessibility and equity in the presentation we did to the ministry and to the committee. So first, we analyzed the impact of the strategic plan on the accessibility by super zone. We looked at, and basically, we looked at accessibility level by public transport for 2018, which is a base year, and 2014. What we did here, we basically calculate from each zone the % of destinations that can be reached by public transportation within a given time, 30 minutes, 45 or 60. And then we kind of weighted average it by all the zone in the metropolitan area. So we see that like currently 2018 is currently the base year, like only in average, only 9% of the destination within the metropolitan can be reached within 30 minutes by public transport. This has been increased by the plan to 20%. This is for the AM peak. And we're kind of repeating this number for the off-peak and PM peak for 45 minutes and 60 minutes, but they all give the same, the picture that basically it is significantly increased accessibility for all day and basically for all those time zones. We also look at this accessibility by specific origin destination. You have in the map of the metropolitan area, where 10 is the core of the metropolitan, the city of Tel Aviv, 21 to 23 the fourth ring, 31 to 33 the second ring, 41 to 43 the outer ring of the metropolitan. And basically what we did here is that again, this is for public transport. What you see in this table, for example, the 35% mean within the core area of Tel Aviv, 35 more destination can be reached in 2040 after implementing the plan comparing to today. So that's the improvement of the percent of the destinations that can be reached. In this case, the percent of population, sorry, within the between that can reach. So we see from 10 to 10, 35% more of the population can reach this within 45 minutes. So as you see, basically the bottom line is that the most significant changes are within the core area where the system is concentrated, obviously, in the first phase. In this sense, it may not be that equitable, so the peripheries, improvement of the peripheries of the metropolitan is somewhere lower. This map presents accessibility by public transportation within 45 minutes in door-to-door. So that means it shows the higher the color is the number of destinations that can be reached by 45 minutes. Again, and this, the left side shows the 2018, the right side shows the 2040, and you can see again how the network, how the plan significantly improve accessibility. But again, it's kind of show that in terms of the area, it's really again improved mostly within the core area. This is maybe, we showed various measures of accessibility. There's somewhat, we're more look at the spatial equity. This is maybe the more one of the, this is how we come to really the equity consideration within the socio-economic within the metropolitan area. This figure shows the breakdown of the accessibility measure by socio-economic groups. So the Statistic Bureau in Israel provide a socio-economic scale from 1 to 10, when 1 is the lowest and 10 is the highest. And this basically shows the average accessibility in the metropolitan area. Now, this here, it's both for transit and car. The previous figure were only for public transport. Here, we really wanted to show the improvement for the overall accessibility. So how many destination and average person from each one of those socioeconomic level can reach in 2018 and 2014. And we see that in 2018, this is the 2 is kind of because it's a small group, because the way the level are defined, 2 is a small group. But basically, it should be kind of think about if it's a linear approximation. 9 is also, those group are smaller. If you think about it, so before we had like somewhat like 30% accessibility to the lower socioeconomic compared to over 50 to the higher socioeconomic group. While after the improvement, we see that everybody improved more than 50, but we see that, but mostly those with the lower socioeconomic have further improvement. So the current low is really low because there's really little public transport service, or the level of services public transport is being. The richer are focused more in the center and have more cars. So in the lack of good public transport, they had high accessibility, even in the, now the lower socioeconomic, once the public transport infrastructure have improved, managed to get accessibility. And this also account also for the periphery of the metropolitan area. So this was the minimum accessibility that everybody has. So this is we found is important in terms of the equity. We also divided with the same groups of a socioeconomic group. We construct the Lorentz curve. So we see that the Lorentz curve, this is for 45 minutes. Again, this is 2018. We see the improvement to 2014. It's maybe does not show with this curve, maybe not showing a big increase. But if we look at the Gini index, we see that it is quite a significant improvement, this area that we show here, the convergence from the red to the blue area of the closer to the equiline of the 45 degrees of the Lorentz curve. We see the Gini index, again, when we look at the overall accessibility distribution between the socioeconomic group, improved from 0.276 to 0.193 for 30 minutes, and similar for 45 minutes. So if I try to conclude this first case study, the strategic public transport plan has major effect on transport equity. It increased accessibility for all population group. It increased more for low socioeconomic group, and it ensures a minimum accessibility of 50% to all area within a daily commute time for all socioeconomic group. One final note that I want to emphasize, and I'll do it again in the next slide, is the importance of presenting all these various measures. These were not under any requirement of the guidance or anything. We have the planning team have developed them and presented them to committee as part of our presentation, and we do believe it has an impact. And I'll go to the next case, which is the rail to the periphery. Again, looking briefly about Israel, this is Israel. This is the metropolitan area of Tel Aviv, which we have discussed earlier. We have another metropolitan area, a smaller one in Haifa and in Jerusalem. And there is one more major city, Beersheba, in the south. But you see the dance of the country is pretty much in the center. All this is kind of, we have the northern periphery and the southern periphery. Israel is a small country, 9.3 million people in an area of 20,000. This area is pretty dense. So, I mean, 22,000 square meters is all of it. I mean, the 9 million are pretty much focused here. And there was really a concern of the government about the link between the north and southern periphery area to the center of the country. So here, the government upfront look at spatial equity as the issue. They did. And then they were really the plan here, the government initiative was to do a high-speed rail in order to address this concern. When we talk in high-speed rail, it's not in the standard of Europe. It's on the low range. We talk about 200 to maybe 250 kilometers per hour is maximum speed. But it's still in Israel, since it's a small country, it is a high-speed rail. So basically, the objective of this case study is really to analyze transport intervention design from the very start to address spatial equity. And we compare two alternatives, basically the rail alternative, and then we look at which we call C1, and then we look at another with a regional BRT, kind of fixed schedule shuttle services to the main train stations that already exist. This map on the right here, basically, this part is this part, the south of Israel. Sorry, and this is continue here to the south. So Beersheba is the main farther south major city, and basically this is just an industrial line. There's one currently line to Dimona, which is a peripheral city, but actually it was to extend it all the way to Eilat. This is a very controversial line, very expensive line. It has mostly also a freight issue because Eilat has a port to the Red Sea. And then basically we talked about another two main line in the north. There is one, this is already peripheral line. This is going to the Jordanian border in the city of Beit Shean. And the plan talk about two lines here, which are quite peripheral. So the formal requirement went back to this multi-criteria objective, similar to the one we had in the Tel Aviv project. Here they looked at four again. Here they define it a little bit different. Transportation here, equity and periphery was put as a major one because that was seen as a very important issue from the beginning. And then economic. And then the economic one and quality life and environment. I'll not get into the detail of this analysis. It's quite, I want to stand in my 40 minutes total time allocated, and I have 5 more minutes. But you see that in terms of, for example, the main difference is that the high-speed rail provide high speed, but with obviously lower frequency and less coverage of the whole periphery, while the BRT has a better coverage of the periphery. And therefore, if we look at inner trips in the periphery, we'll have better performance of the BRT than the high-speed rail. If we look at the population periphery, we see 90 minutes to the center of Tel Aviv, the high-speed rail will have a benefit over the BRT. So overall, there were not significant differences between the performance of them, but the BRT one did provide better coverage and better equity issues as we look. And obviously, the cost is significantly different. The cost here, you see the benefit cost of the high-speed rail is 1. This was only the red part, the additional part of the periphery. This was a $12 billion US dollar estimate, while the BRT was something $1.5 billion. So this was but basically both alternative really significantly improved over the current state here. The current one was 2015 here. The main mobility, the main equity or accessibility measure we wanted to introduce here was the potential mobility index that was developed by Karl Martens, and as far as we know was first used here. The idea of this potential mobility index, in short, is basically to it's somewhat of a speed index. It's look at the distance divided by the actual travel time, and the actual travel time is here. So it's basically reflected by the transport network. The better it's connected, the better the speed. The advantage is really that it takes into account both the network structure and the quality of service, because if you have better connectivity, if you have more service, higher speed, it will provide higher. So this is kind of an areal, this is an index, it's what it actually is an index of areal speed. So basically we applied, we applied on a national level, because let's look at that this plan was considered strategic national periphery plan. And we looked at the national level. If we look from every destination, what is for each destination, we use what we do here. We from a given region, you sum this aerial distance divided by actual travel time and you sum it overall and you average it over all destination. So in this table here, we do some comparison between the two plans. We applied this potential mobility index on two different measures. One on in-vehicle speed, which look only the travel time from station to station, but more important, we think, is really door to door, including the access and egress time. So what we see basically, and this is just some representative city. Beit She'an is a city in the north that currently has a service. I want to show. In Dimona, the one city of the south that currently have train services. The rest of the cities are new cities that will gain service either to the BRT or to the train services. And we basically see that when we look at in-vehicle speed, obviously the high-speed rail provide better performance than the BRT. But when we look at the door-to-door, the BRT provide better services than the indexes than the high-speed rail. Again, there's some variation, but this is in roughly. But in roughly, both plan provide significant improvement to the periphery and average 30% higher speeds than currently they provided. If I am going to summarize this case study, the high-speed rail service will provide shorter travel time from the periphery to the center of the country and may change the experience time space in Israel, which was a government vision. The BRT will provide more coverage, more stop and higher frequency, but lower in-vehicle speed than the rail. It basically showed that the regional BRT is more efficient and provide good service to the periphery with good coverage. And I think the case was pretty clear, but again, there is something with the rail bonus, which is a big issue. I have another paper on this. The rail bonus kind of and somewhat biased toward, and there is some bias toward rail investment. But the question of the high cost is really an issue. To come to a conclusion for the entire presentation, what I think are the major takeout that I would like to convey from my presentation. First, there's no right way to account for equity in transport operation. It's really a complex issue, and it may vary by the objective, by social values, by government policies, even analytically. Even if we just want to maximize, there's really no right way. I didn't cover there's rich literature on different approaches. I think we are still in a question in some sense I would say, and I think before somebody asked what is the kind of the ideal way to conduct appraisal. I think there's no ideal way, and there's no right way. It should be really advanced modeling and computation can help to improve equity incorporation in appraisal and planning, but also does not provide really the right way. And therefore, we really think that equity should be considered in the planning process as part of its objective. And it should be done so from the beginning of the planning process. It should seek to guarantee adequate accessibility for all through, as Carl defined, regulation, operation, maintenance, and improvement of the transport system. One more thing, there can be many measures of equity. We only show a few examples that are endless in the literature. We kind of believe that the more equity measure we show to the decision maker, the more we analyze, it does improve the likelihood of taking equity more seriously in the process by the policymaker. Thank you.